Hello and welcome to the Reorg, where we dive into the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute archives and re-examine old ideas after years of accumulated proof of work. This is your host, Michael Goldstein, also known as Bitstein, and joining me as always is my co-host, Pierre Rochard. Pierre, welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me back on for this excellent next article.
Yes, so this is a short and sweet one. The last two episodes have been our dives into some of the ideas around altcoins, and now we're getting into an article from 2014 called Appcoins Are Snake Oil. And so this article was written on May 24th, 2014. The price of Bitcoin was about $527. And this article is interesting because it's talking about a rather early concept that exploded into what became a sort of major concept and, shall I say, nuisance to us Bitcoin maxis. So I think it's an interesting one. Like I said, it's short, but I think there's a lot to be said about what has happened since this article. So without further ado, I'll hop right in. I'll start by saying, for the people who are just listening, the main image on this article is a gentleman eating at a table, and he has on his head a Rube Goldberg machine to help use a napkin to wipe his face while eating. And the idea here is just the complex over-engineering that people apply trying to solve, imagined problems. But even worse is we'll get into the rationalizations for a lot of money grubbing. So we'll hop into the article itself. Introduction. Appcoins. What a great way to fund an open source project, right? The idea began with Mastercoin, but seems to have jumped from there to become its own meme. You just create an app and then make it less convenient by creating a cryptocurrency, or quote, app coin, that is required to use it, some of which you sell to investors to pay for the development of the app. There's no way that couldn't work. It's just like selling stock in a company, right? Wrong. As will be shown, whereas the value of a stock is related to the value of the company that issued it, there is no such connection between an app coin and an app. And there is consequently no reason to expect the app coin ever to become valuable. For this reason, app coins should not be considered a valid investment and are inappropriate as a means of funding open source projects. Furthermore, once the arguments in this essay become well enough understood by investors, that it will be impossible to fund a project by selling an app coin because the price will rapidly tend to zero. Now, just as a little bit of a background, there's mention of Mastercoin, which we have an article that it's not in the crash course, but it's in the, just the mempool blog in general about Mastercoin in particular and kind of the nonsense around the motivating ideas and whether or not it was a reasonable idea. But at that time, so around, this early 2014, this is when we started to hear about this concept of dApps, or decentralized apps. And this was pushed heavily, especially it was actually coined by someone here in Austin. There was a group called BitAngels that was sort of trying to do VC funding around these ideas. I believe someone we know even got paid in Mastercoin at one point, which is probably worse than any kind of income problem that AOC has ever complained about in her life. But yeah, so, Austin was an interesting place during this time in Bitcoin because on the one hand, we had sort of the heart of, shall we say, Bitcoin maximalism, and on the other, we had these very early ideas with some of the worst kind of utility token stuff. But perhaps that's why the sort of Austin Bitcoin community had this sort of Bitcoin maximalism in mind, because we were directly facing a lot of this. But the Appcoin idea came a little later. It was basically the Silicon Valley play into this concept. But yeah, so just to kind of give some historical context, this was there had been like a bunch of ideas floating around, because people had started to think basically with Mastercoin is like, oh, we can attach additional data onto Bitcoin, and that itself becomes its own protocol, and you can have its own kind of currency, but it's all tied to Bitcoin. So this is also very much, the app coins that we're describing in this article, what they became tended to be completely separated from Bitcoin. But there was also, it was coming out of what has remained to this day, which is the I'm building on Bitcoin concept because I happen to be shoving some data into Bitcoin. Even though this thing is creating its own free-floating currency, it has this vague tie to Bitcoin in a technical sense. So therefore, it's actually building on top. And we've heard that through, more recently, the people making what they call layer 2 technologies, even when they're not things like Lightning that are actually ultimately settled on the base chain. So continuing on, the value of a stock. A stock is a contract between owners of an enterprise which grants its bearers the right to a portion of the liquidation value of the company and to any dividends that it offers. Consequently, there is a reason to expect growth of the company to increase the price of its stock. The higher the probability that a company will increase the value of its net assets, the higher the expected price of its stock, and vice versa. Hence, a stock can be a perfectly legitimate investment if the company issuing it is not fraudulent. Just because you are the finance person, I did want to ask, is there anything else that you think is sort of important for people to understand about what makes a stock a stock?
No, I think that captures it, and this paragraph is accurate. Let's see where he goes with it.
Okay, just wanted to make sure, because these finance things, we do notice sometimes in the Bitcoin community, because there is a drive to get rid of central banks and such. There's often a lot of collateral damage of a lot of actually totally legitimate, sort of corporate entities, corporate instruments, financial instruments, etc., that have a perfectly legitimate reason to exist in the free market, but they become sort of collateral damage in this desire to overhaul the financial system, as opposed to perhaps just focusing in on, the key issues of central banking.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great time to vibe on that, because as we record this, our friend Jack Mahler's just announced that he is starting a Bitcoin-backed company that is very much, into issuing stock equity here, as Daniel described, and it's in line with what we've seen from Michael Saylor with his strategy, and it's been really interesting to see kind of the responses to it, because I think that on one hand, there's the cypherpunk ethos of not your keys, not your Bitcoin, and therefore any kind of asset is either, it should be about owning it because of its utility, intrinsic utility, let's call it, like a house with a roof that keeps the rain out from you, or it should be Bitcoin. And so then essentially closing off any kind of thought of, well, what about owning a share in a business, even, putting aside whether the business holds Bitcoin or not, because let's start with that, because I think that my argument against owning the share of a business would be a question of valuation. That is are you going to have a higher expected value, a risk-adjusted return from a business that is let's say a car washing business, than from holding Bitcoin? And so we're all bullish on Bitcoin, so we'd say, well, no, okay, you shouldn't hold the equity of the car wash business. You should actually just hold Bitcoin. And it becomes a lot more complicated when we talk about a business where actually the business is holding Bitcoin, and they're going to use the economies of scale of that Bitcoin capital base to borrow cheap dollars. And that's where, it's like, okay, well, you're going leverage long Bitcoin. That adds more risk on top of just the added custody risk of somebody else, managing the keys. And that I think is the great debate of the financial engineering, which I'm a huge fan of the financial engineering side. I think that's actually how we get Bitcoin to go to the next stage of hyper Bitcoinization. But I think the cypherpunk ethos finds it repulsive.
I would actually, I would push back on the cypherpunk ethos, finding that repulsive, in the sense that I think a lot of people try to use the term cypherpunk ethos, and I'm not speaking just about you.
Oh, you
general,
are. Yeah, I got it.
Well, they
No.
I think people forget that the cypherpunks itself as a group was a very diverse group, and you had people who had some much more revolutionary spirits in terms of what they wanted to achieve with technology, and you also have attitudes of trying to effectively use cryptography to make basically stronger institutions, in a free market sense, better property rights, basically be able to re-engineer things so that we can have the institutions that we like in society, but have them in a way that do not have some of the costs that have been associated with them. So for instance, when you have Xiaomi and banks, well, you're not getting rid of banks, you have banks. The difference is, hey, here's a way that you can actually issue the currency that no longer requires you to have electronic payments lose its privacy compared to cash. You can actually create a way to retain these things while still operating in the digital realm, which of course would open up a lot of internet trade and so on and so forth. Electronic transfers that most of us are buying a lot of things online now, and so. There's sort of this trying to put it all in one particular ideological frame, and while a lot of these different frames you can find it within the cypherpunks, I don't know that it's fully accurate to try to apply it to cypherpunks as a whole. I think there's a much broader way of looking at how these technologies are applied. And I think the most humorous one to me is when we see hatred towards the financial system and such, in terms of it's the suits, the suits versus the hoodies. Yeah. Which is also funny because, Jack Mallers himself is someone who much prefers the hoodie. And I've only seen him wearing suits when he's entering a place where that's very much expected for the decorum. But he's primarily a hoodie as it is. But, to think that that's out of line with the cypherpunks, I think it was Rob Hamilton had a great tweet at one point talking about cypherpunks wear suits, and he had pictures of everyone from Phil Zimmerman to Julian Assange. In fact, Julian Assange almost was always wearing a suit back in the WikiLeaks days. So it's actually it's perfectly in line with cypherpunk ethos to dress in a nice formal fashion. So I think these things, that there's more ways to look at it, and I think I think it's dependent on kind of your view of libertarianism, and if there's different ways of, we see this among libertarians. There are types who they want everyone to just be sort of sovereign individuals, and the sort of sovereign citizen type, where it's just like we're all a bunch of atomistic homesteaders. But then you also have people who greatly admire the institutions that people are able to form through private contracting. And, on that side of things, I think people should look to people like Nick Szabo as a brilliant mind for being able to describe why these institutions exist, where their flaws are, and how we can use cryptography and software to improve their ability to deliver on what people look to them from. All that being said, we can go ahead and get back to the article and see how it relates to the Appcoins. So the value of an app coin. On the other hand, the value of an app coin can move completely independently of the value of the app itself. This is because the value of a currency is due to the value of the network of people holding it, which is a logically separate concept to the network using the app. The value of the app is a matter entirely of the service it provides, whereas the value of the app coin partly due to the value of the app and partly to its competition with other currencies. If there are two currencies to choose, there is a relative disutility of holding the one which has the smaller market cap. The disutility becomes stronger as the difference between their market caps becomes greater. Because any app coin must compete with Bitcoin, there is inherently an aversion to holding the app coin rather than Bitcoin. This means that the app can always improve by transitioning to use Bitcoin instead of the app coin. Since we are talking about open source projects, it is always possible for anyone to fork an existing app and make the changes himself. And in a footnote, there's a similar effect between Bitcoin and the dollar because Bitcoin is such an enormous technological achievement over the dollar, Bitcoin continues to grow despite the dollar's superior network. And if an app coin could manage to reduce transaction costs by an order of magnitude versus Bitcoin, then it should be expected to defeat Bitcoin and all the other app coins too. It is further, going back to the main article, it is furthermore not necessary to assume that the app must be forked to remove its dependence on the app coin. As soon as the developers have sold out of their pre-mined app coins, there will be nothing preventing them from upgrading the app themselves to support Bitcoin. All nodes running the app who are acting as service providers will also desire this because it will generate more business for them. I do not see how investors in the app coin could expect to prevent this. That should eliminate the expectation that any app coin could ever be a good investment. And then there's a picture riffing off the underwear gnomes in South Park, but it's, phase 1 app coins, phase 2 something, question mark, phase 3 profit. So it's sort of just like we're gonna introduce app coins, and then some app coin magic is gonna happen, and we'll all profit. So yeah, there's sort of this conflation of concepts with app coins, where on the one hand, it's treated as this thing that we can actually use as a stock, as like a way to sort of sell equity in the company so that you can raise money. But then they also want to use the utility token to explain the value of the coin and what people are going to actually, want to hold it for. And so there's just this total conflation.
Yeah, and it's also, in a way, it's like, okay, with money, the whole point of money is you can, eventually buy things with it after you're done holding it. And to say that, this service, it's going to require this utility token, either you're limiting the possible set of people who would buy the service because you're arbitrarily limiting how they can buy it, or you're limiting what the utility token can do by saying, well, it's not money, you can't use it for anything else, you can only use it for this particular thing. And so in either case, it's almost, as you pointed out, a reduction to barter. You're reducing the double coincidence of wants.
Yeah, and I would say that there's conflations like this are something that we see across a number of different things that I would view as scams. Another one is fractional reserve banking, where there's a conflation where you're saying this is a demand deposit, but it's also a time deposit and like a loan at the same time. And it's like, well, no, you should just choose one. Except in this case, it's even worse because it's like, okay, I can understand, selling equity to raise money, but the utility token itself is exactly, it is a reversion to barter. There's no reason to actually have the thing. But it is interesting how that we do see these types of conflations and arguments as a way to kind of basically scam people, or in a nicer way of putting it, to just play off people's ignorance. And yeah, I think it's also just a strange way to raise money. There's sort of a decentralization theater here because stocks in and of themselves are naturally centralized. I think there's like this idea that, oh, like you can just have this currency that's stock, but when you issue stock, it's coming from a corporation, and that corporation is something that is inherently centralized in the sense of there is a specific entity. And so it's sort of weird to treat it as you're raising this money, which is clearly, going to the funding of a specific sort of corporate entity, whether it's a foundation, whether it's an actual like for-profit thing, like in a more explicit sense. But also this is like some like just open project. And so I think some of that decentralization theater is also able to patch over the realities of the inherent centralization of these things, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with, centralized equities. You can have equity in companies for very good reasons, but you don't like pretend that Apple is actually some decentralized thing.
And it would be insane for Apple to say you can only buy iPhones using Apple shares. It's like, why did you add this extra step in me acquiring the iPhone? But anyway, yeah, we can continue.
Yes, I think that's in here with a great header title, Beating a Dead Horse. And this is a dead horse that, we just unfortunately have to keep beating. But so beating a dead horse. Even if the app could somehow remain locked behind the Appcoin wall, there is still no reason to expect the Appcoin to become valuable. If the users of the app cannot avoid holding the Appcoin entirely, then they would prefer to hold it for the shortest time possible. There is an opportunity cost for all time spent holding the Appcoin because better currencies are available which can be expected to provide better opportunities. There is thus an economic incentive to provide services which make the Appcoin as invisible as possible, so as to provide access to the app with as little hassle as possible. But necessarily, as a given number of users learns to hold their Appcoins for lower and lower periods of time, the value of the coin must decrease and the price of app services in its own Appcoin must increase. Suppose there were, say, 100 people sharing 1,000 Appcoins at a given time with about 10 each, and they learn to get rid of their Appcoins to use the service twice as quickly. Then it must be more like only 50 people sharing 1,000 Appcoins with 20 each. Even if the user base increased rapidly, it could not for long counteract the incentive to make the Appcoin insignificant to the app user. Not everyone buys an Appcoin to interact with the system, of course. Some buy it as an investment. However, after understanding the economics described in this article, investors will no longer be so innocent as to see value in an Appcoin. An investor cannot ultimately expect to make a return on an Appcoin given that there is an incentive to disconnect the coin from the app. Once that happens, the Appcoin is simply another altcoin. Furthermore, the more that investors realize that other investors also understand the worthlessness of Appcoins, the less successful will the Appcoin be as a method of funding projects. If there are not enough gullible investors to buy the coin, then the developers can sell as many as they want without raising enough money. The only reason they can be used now is that the issues are not yet generally understood to be a scam. However, that is precisely what they are. It is grossly unethical to sell something which adds no value and which can be expected always to become worthless in the end. And I think this is the flaw, like we said, with any, quote, utility token. And a similar thing that we've heard in relation to Bitcoin is the idea, well, you can't fight the US dollar or you can't outcompete the US dollar because the US dollar is the one that's backed by taxation. That is to say that people have to pay the United States government in dollars in order to pay their taxes, and they're not going to be able to avoid that, certainly not without a punishment. And so people have a reason to hold dollars and give the dollar value. But the problem with this is, yeah, you can just you can hold dollars just long enough to pay your taxes. And in fact, I think most prudent savers and investors avoid cash as much as possible. So, that's not that argument for the dollar being paid by taxes is just another utility token meme, and I think it's plainly false.
I'm still trying to figure out who is actually holding dollars, honestly. Because even if you're holding dollars at a checking account, the bank is lending out those dollars, so technically the bank's not holding those dollars. It is a game of hot potato. And it's also, this is why I like when governments announce, oh, we're going to accept taxes paid with Bitcoin. Bitcoiners are like, oh, I would never give them my Bitcoin. And I'm like, that's besides the point. I think it's a great way to defeat this argument. Obviously, there's the intellectual defeat that you've pointed out here, but then there's also the practical defeat of saying, hey, actually, you can pay your taxes with Bitcoin, and that'll happen as governments realize that they need to have more Bitcoin.
Which also means that, when the government were to, if for that one person out there who decides to pay in Bitcoin, maybe perhaps because it was easier than having to sell it themselves and take on an additional tax burden in order to pay, maybe that's, I assume they wouldn't charge you capital gains if you're paying taxes, but I don't know. But
would, I promise you. They would.
Oh, okay.
No, usually it comes packaged with, removing the capital gains taxes and making taxes payable in Bitcoin with kind of the legal tender angle to it.
So I'm just trying to imagine that one guy is like, okay, I'll give Bitcoin as taxes. That also puts the government in a position where it's like, now they have Bitcoin and they have to figure out what to do with it. And, it's it's quite embarrassing to have been an organization that did not choose to hold their Bitcoins and instead lose a lot of money. So we saw this with the United States government. They, different libertarians might argue differently about how legitimate them having certain coins were, but the fact is they sold them. There was a lot of coins they did sell, and it is an embarrassment for any organization to have to show that they did not take seriously something that they should have. So it also forces governments at the margins to have to think a little bit more about Bitcoin and what to do with it. So yeah, it's an interesting one. We also see, with Bitcoiners, there's a lot of Bitcoiners who have, taken up, in fact, Jack Mallers, I believe, is one of these who have chosen, they just don't even want to hold dollars anymore. Somewhat in like a just ideological position of just like, I don't want to participate in dollar holding and being inflated away at all. And so those types of people, they operate with credit cards and pay off their credit card. So, you sell Bitcoin, just enough Bitcoin to pay off the credit card payments for the month. And so as far as like being in fiat, it's exactly this. These are Bitcoiners who really are taking that logic to its extreme, where you have the utility token of tax dollars and they only have those dollars literally long enough to instantaneously get the Bitcoin into fiat and get that fiat sent off to the credit card company. And you have services, also created by Jack Mallers. I think he has now where they'll send it for you. So it's like you personally don't even have to think about fiat at all. For those people can just literally send off the Bitcoin, and something behind the scenes instantaneously gets it all figured out for them. And if you don't want to hold those utility tokens, you don't have to. And some of those people might, depending on how the price moves, overall see, great increases in the marginal amounts of sats that they would have had. So that's sort of seeing this logic play out in practice. And this is just going to be the truth for any utility token. I also wonder who is holding the dollars. And sometimes I've wondered, and I don't know how you'd quantify this. Maybe there's someone out there who can figure this out. But in what sense is, like, we can see the Bitcoin market cap compared to other fiat, not other, but compared to fiat currencies and like where it stands among those. But is there some way of quantifying specifically of who actually just like holds this in an account, in a wallet for Bitcoin, just like sitting there, versus dollars, where it's this thing that a lot of people more just use the dollar as something to denominate their other assets in rather than actually holding the dollars?
Yeah, I think Rothbard came up with basically an Austrian money supply metric, which is like M0, the dollars held at the Federal Reserve, and then just the physical cash out there, which then it's like it really, I think it is the case that the physical cash is, we might think that we use cash less and less here in the United States. But if you look globally, there's people who, the U.S. government flies pallets of $100 bills across the world to everyone. So clearly there's a lot of end use abroad.
Yeah, so that would be interesting if there is a way to get some of these metrics. And from that perspective, where does Bitcoin really stand? And is it possible that Bitcoin is even bigger already than we think, and it just needs to eat away at liquidating the kind of fiat nonsense? So coming up on the conclusion, Appcoins are a terrible idea, and furthermore, this shouldn't require such a deep analysis to realize. They are clearly just a needless complexity. Why would I want to use different money for my gas, food, and rent? This defeats the whole purpose of having a money economy. How can these Appcoin proponents think they're accomplishing something with that? It's like they're trying to invent a barter system again, except improve it by adding trade barriers and a bunch of imaginary extra goods that aren't useful for anything, but that people are required to trade with for some reason. In fact, it's not like that. It's exactly what they're doing. Appcoins are pump and dump scams. Appcoins are pump and dump scams disguised as Rube Goldberg machines. So don't get fooled. And pictured is a classic Far Side cartoon where someone's in a little store, but all of the shelves are way up high near the ceiling, impossible to reach. And the caption says "inconvenient stores." And I do think that is a wonderful illustration of what's going on here. So, like, he's reiterating this thing, the dead horse we continue to beat. Creating more money is effectively a reversion to a state of barter. And I do think that creating these app coins, it takes away, if you have an actually interesting app idea, you're taking away from it by trying to attach anything other than just Bitcoin payments or whatever, because you're focused on the money and making sure number go up or whatever with your pumping of that, as opposed to actually delivering on a good app that people want to use. And they would be much better off accepting Bitcoin payments for whatever app that they have, and tracking how well they're doing based on how many sats they can earn relative to how many sats it costs to produce the app. And it really seems rather simple, but it just that sort of makes it all the more confusing that people have just ignored and pretended not to get it. But I would associate that with some level of just ignorance when you have a lot of new people coming in, but also just outright greed. And I think this article was very prescient in the sense that this was written in 2014, and we didn't really see the ICO craze until 2017, 2018. But it was all operating off the exact same thing. It's just like it was the new iteration of the same concepts with a little bit of a better marketing. ICO has, a much more, it's like, initial coin offering. It has this sort of, professional financial kind of lingo attached to it that you can make it seem much more polished and refined than these older schemes. But it's the exact same thing. These early app coins were just at a smaller scale. So the last thing that I want to point out here, so this article was actually originally called "Appcoins are fraudulent," and readers who were on the opposite side of this article, the one that this was targeting, were not too happy with being called fraudsters. And so there's an extended footnote I'd like to read and discuss related to that. And this will come up again many articles later when we get to the article I wrote called "Everyone's a Scammer." But I'm going to go ahead and read this footnote. I have been criticized over my use of the word fraud in an earlier version of this article. This usually implies an intent to deceive. I do not know whether the Appcoins that already exist were sold under intentionally false pretenses. I merely consider it to be a likely possibility. As a comparison, if someone were selling a perpetual motion machine or homeopathic medicine, then obviously he is making false claims about his product. Without evidence as to what the seller is thinking, it cannot be established that he is deliberately lying. However, the truth should be so easily available to the seller that deception on his part becomes a likely explanation for his actions. In the case of Appcoins, I do not think that the issues discussed in this article are very difficult to understand, so I would suspect someone who spent a lot of time working on them to have come to some understanding of the problem with them and the ethical problem of selling them. However, the important issue is not whether the seller knows the truth, but rather that he is harming people either way. I did not intend to emphasize the issue of intent with this article, and it is really irrelevant to the main point, but that was what much of the response to this article was about. This response proves I used the word fraud incorrectly. There is a concept called constructive fraud, which can apply to when a seller misrepresents a product in spite of an ethical duty to represent it correctly. This concept fits better for what I meant, but if I wanted to say that, I should have explained it more clearly. They are deceivers in the same sense that quack doctors are deceivers, which is to say that they might be deceiving others or they might be deceiving themselves. And, this has been a thing. People have been complaining about maximalists, calling everyone scammers or a fraud or whatever for a long time. And I do think that, this actually is like an important kind of point where it's not necessarily like an accusation in the sense of, wanting any kind of legal action to be taken against them, although there are cases where that is certainly justified. I think Celsius, was outright fraudulent, but the fact that it's not really about intent, and it's like it's okay that it's not okay. It's like even if you actually believe what you're selling, that doesn't change the fact that it is at odds with some basic kind of economic thinking, and it's that should be focused on.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, what came out of the litigation between the SEC and Ripple over XRP, which is kind of framed as a utility token, like an Appcoin, was that the reason why Ripple, the reason why it's not equity, and that Ripple is not doing anything wrong from a securities law perspective, is that they're not promising any utility. So it's like, all right, either
utility token.
Yeah, exactly. It's like either they're not actually delivering on what they're implying, or it is a security. So it's kind of, they try to have their cake and eat it too. And so the SEC tried to say, well, it's about the ecosystem that they're creating, that they're responsible for. And so that didn't really work very well in court. And so the bottom line is that from a legal perspective, the reason why Appcoins are not fraudulent is because the promoters of Appcoins are not saying that this will have any utility. So, it goes back to just, okay, so it's just another currency. And I guess anybody can issue a currency.
Raise money.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and it's like you get the seigniorage profits because you're the monopoly issuer, right? Nobody else can issue XRP, and that's where the law stands at this point.
Yeah. Well, and when we got into the sort of ICO craze, Silicon Valley was just ablaze with crypto and creating ICOs. And one of the problems that a lot of Bitcoin maximalists had with it was the fact that they were talking about this as the fundraising mechanism, which, obviously there's already these conflation of stuff, but they'd also be saying, oh, we're raising money. And the reason that we do it as an ICO is because that makes it this sort of free and open market that allows anyone to be an investor. And we no longer have to worry about, accredited investor type rules, which, we could quibble with the SEC about what ways should people be kept from making investments and things they want to make investments in. So it was touted as this way to have free and open markets to allow anyone to invest. But at the same time, a lot of these had this thing of giving the first sales to connected parties, so friends of the altcoin, like the Appcoin, ICO, whatever promoters, it would be like their VC friends are the ones who get first in line. So it's it's this open market, but also the people who dominate these things anyway, the ones who are doing investing, they're the ones who get to get in before just the random retail guys, which, really starts to stink of, real pump and dump action in a really slimy way.
Yeah, and the arbitrage was that they're not accountable for actually delivering a product because they're explicitly saying we're not going to deliver the utility, otherwise we would be violating securities laws. So then what happens is that fast forward, let's say 2 years, the investors in the ICO have not received any kind of return because the promoter of it, the creator of it, did not actually build anything, or if they did build it, it didn't actually have any real application or product market fit, and then the coin loses its value, and that's I think what ultimately undid the ICO boom. It was not a kind of regulatory crackdown; it was just the economics of it made it so that people learned their lesson, they got burned, and now it has. The learning from that was that let's just take one step further and really, really not promise anything with a meme coin. And so that way you're even getting rid of the idea that there's going to be a product behind it.
It's just a meme, bro.
It's commemorating a special moment in time.
Yes, and you can just have a community of holders of, the other people who enjoy that meme can come together and, play shell games with each other. So yeah, that's an important point too, with, the regulatory stuff around this is they are not even good at protecting consumers. They've been terrible at protecting consumers, and they don't warn people of how silly this stuff is. They wait until things have already blown up to go in and be like, oh, okay, I guess we have to look into this and make a fuss. And so this, is a good reminder that Bitcoin maximalists have actually sort of been at the forefront of real consumer protection, because they're the ones who put out articles like this or tweets or whatever it is that they can get the word out about what is actually happening here and why people should want to avoid it based on these simple premises. And when you have simple premises, the other side can easily start making more and more complex rationalizations why those simple premises don't actually matter. And unfortunately, some people could fall for that as well. But I do think that those the simple things, we talked about this another time of where does the yield come from? These types of questions are that simple questions should be able to get pretty simple answers on these. And so it is, I think it's a good thing that people really beat the drum on this. And in some sense, perhaps for myself looking back, perhaps I could have done more instead of just oh, okay, an article is written. It's well, the drum needs to be beat much more than that to get these ideas across to people.
Yeah, but in your defense, I think a lot of people want to learn the hard way. They need to learn the hard way before
Yes.
they're open-minded to actually doing the intellectual work.
Yes, in which case you also just have to be there ready to like help them out when they're ready to make sense of the errors in their ways.
And
So
that is the value of this podcast and of the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute.
yes. Well, yeah. Well, I guess that's all there is on this. There's probably going to be much more to come in terms of what people try to hawk. Maybe they'll come up with more stuff beyond meme coins. We'll have to see. Although it is rather optimistic in a sense that the arguments for these things have gotten that thin. Now, the actual amount of money those things still raise is very big. There's a lot of people who want to play games. There's a lot of people who get, just scammed as retail investors. But when the arguments are wearing that thin, perhaps we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
I think the other light at the end of the tunnel, bringing a full circle to our earlier conversation about Bitcoin-backed equities, was that a lot of the motivation on the buyer side of utility tokens was that they explicitly wanted to try to outperform Bitcoin. And that they saw this utility tokens as a way of outperforming Bitcoin. But now that the capital markets actually enable people to go leverage long Bitcoin, now they have a pure way to try to outperform Bitcoin by taking on more risk. And so the leverage is directly on top of Bitcoin rather than indirectly through a proxy that mechanically might or might not outperform Bitcoin. Might in the short term, right, with the pumps, but mechanically in the long term does not outperform Bitcoin because of the monetary economics.
Yeah, so Bitcoin eating up TradFi is making TradFi Bitcoin native, and giving you a way to actually build on Bitcoin, and in hopefully in literal ways as well, of in what kind of ways can it power more real capital production.
Yep.
So, all right. Well, thank you for listening to the Reorg. This podcast is brought to you by the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, dedicated to advancing and preserving Bitcoin knowledge. Our mission is to deepen understanding and appreciation of Bitcoin, not just for today, but for generations to come, by creating enduring educational resources and generational knowledge for generational wealth. If you enjoyed the show, please support our work by sharing links, deepening your own Bitcoin knowledge by exploring and studying the SNI archives, and contributing sats. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely entirely on supporters like you. Whether you can give a few Satoshis or a few thousand Bitcoins, your contributions enable us to continue educating current and future Bitcoiners worldwide.